morning, everybody. Today we want to talk about neurosubjectivities, and I will do this in a more general level at the beginning, and then Suparna will go into detail and hopefully refute all the claims that I make, because they are unfounded. First, I have to disagree a little bit with Ian. Woody called it my second favorite organ. I'm not so sure anymore. I mean, personally, maybe, but is that still the cultural truth that it was in the 70s? Catherine Malabou, in her new book, has a subheading, From Sexuality to Cerebrality. And so that's the new cultural template. Yeah, in a way. I mean, unfortunately, Daniel is not here. It's not as funny anymore, and we're craving for the Woody Allen of the brain. But the question is if we are better off with Woody Allen of the brain or without. So there is something changing here. And just to introduce one notion that has been floated by Joseph Dumit, the anthropologist who worked on PET imaging, objective self-fashioning. And well, it's basically a notion that tries to answer or address the question how neuroscience is impacting concepts of subjectivity and selfhood. And well, then here's the short definition. The objective self is an embodied theory of human nature, both scientific and popular. So the claim is basically that, again, as self-interpreting animals, humans are basically sucking in all sorts of concepts, ideas, elements, tools, techniques, cultural practices to construct the self-image out of it. And that's a very broad process, a process that is, of course, has local differences and variances. But science, or a part of the human science, provides building blocks for these assemblages of self. And of course, then there's a strategy, and something that we do and that anthropologists of science and culture do, is trace these processes, how components of a self-understanding are assembled from elements of science, and how science is catering the need and the demand of people to have these elements and changing self-conceptions. So, and of course it has an affective, an emotional dimension to it. It has a medial, a discursive dimension to it. And that's basically the broad horizon of the thoughts that we want to present here. And of course, and this basically carries me already back to what we had yesterday, the MRI scanner, the PET scanner, all the other imaging technologies, they basically exert an influence, a formatting power, something that is over and above the scientific, experimental, data gathering character of these devices. So these images are, of course, popular symbols that travel through the media and through all of culture, but then also the scanner itself. And Amir was talking a little bit about it, how the scanner has a specific space, a space in which specific rules apply, and there are, of course, persons who operate it, who are the experts, and who basically bring you in there. And it's really, we should have done this guide through the scanner facility to see it, how much of an immediate physical and spatial appeal the scanning side has. And I think you can say that there's something magical about it in a specific sense, and I think a sense that really has religious connotations. You have the priests that operate the room, that guide it, that see to it that the rules are obeyed, and then, of course, you have this ritualistic arrangement. It takes a long time. You have to take all the metal objects out, and then you are strapped to this thing and put into that machine, and then it has these strange sounds, and in the end, of course, and there's this moment of relief on your first scan when they tell you that you indeed have a brain. I remember that quite vividly in my case, because I was a bit skeptical before. And so I want to talk about that a little more by giving you this quotation from Roland Barthes, the cultural theorist from France. And he spoke specifically about the power of objects to exert a certain influence, certain magic even. So he's talking, and this might be a bit blasphemous now from me to compare the MRI scanner with this wonderful car. I hope you can see it a little bit, the Citroën DS19 from 1965. And when that was released, Roland Barthes had a little analysis of that moment when he saw it. So here's a quotation: "We must not forget that an object is the best messenger of a world above that of nature. One can easily see in an object at once a perfection and an absence of origin, a closure and a brilliance, a transformation of life into matter. Matter is much more magical than life. And in a word, a silence which belongs to the realm of fairy tales." And I think that this captures several things that are interesting about the MRI scanner. In a way, he says, I think before that quotation, he said that the new Citroën has fallen from the sky, literally. Suddenly it is there. It materializes in this specific objective character. And he says there's a perfection in the object and an absence of origin. And I think you can apply this to the scanner in the following way. In its sheer physical material presence and its seamless operation, and of course it is a seamless operation once it is up and running and you're in there as a patient to be scanned, the device makes us forget how much arduous work has been invested in its construction, in the experimental setup, of course the whole developmental history of that machine, and of course how hard it will in the end be to extract any kind of meaningful data, let alone meaningful interpretations that can feed into theories, etc., from that procedure. Once the thing is there, it just operates, and it gives you this impression that that's what we do, how we do it. That's how science functions. That's the model of a certain practice that is self-evident. And of course, you have the self-evident appeal of the people that operate the machine, that don't ask any questions, but that they know what they do. And then that's the first idea, that the object has this completion in it. And sometimes you have this impression, of course, with cars. When you see an old timer on the street, you get this feeling that it's not only the car there, but it brings with it its own world. You feel a flashback to the 50s, 60s, 70s in which these cars were riding around. And so I think that's a very important observation, that the material object in its ready-made operation calls forth its own world. And the second idea here, a related idea, is the transformation, as Barth calls it, of life into matter, an objectification of life. And in the case of the scanner, of course, you have the translation or quasi-translation of living subjectivity of an individual that lies in the scanner into the objectified and concretely materialized brain image, plus the whole technical setup and that theoretical framework that this science is embedded in, so that, in a way, the messy reality of the human is transferred into something that has at least the appeal of being objective, controlled, material, and readable. So in a way, this sort of vague meaningfulness of human subjectivity is turned into something that is concretely readable and extractable from, with help from the machine. And then there's a side remark that matter is much more magical than life. So the magic which fascinates pertains often much rather to the material, particularly to technical constructed objects, less than to the living being. So that's really it's a big cultural theory of material objecthood behind that, but I think there is something to it, and this might just give us a hint of why it can be that we feel a certain satisfaction or fascination in being objectified ourselves. So that's probably a claim that I want to bring out there, that there's something appealing about being, in a certain sense, desubjectivized, deanimated by the processes or the objectification processes of neuroscientific measurements. That would be a claim we have to talk about. So, well, this maybe previews a strange attraction that comes with scientific objectifications, and why it is not such that there is a broad range of resistances mounted against neuroscientific objectifications of subjectivity. Again, here are some of the pictures that Amir was just talking about yesterday, that he was evoking but not showing. The MEG scanner, where you have this sort of the whole house on top of you, and I mean this guy, so, I don't know if you see his facial expression, but that he's really stunned by the kind of science fiction arrangement that he's sitting in. And here's an MRI scanner. So, I mean, Amir would probably agree that constitutes a kind of placebo space. So the placebo is really also in the setting, in the arrangement, and in the practices that surround it. And then once you're in there, you're somehow enthralled and fascinated by it, so that the scientific imposes its logic in this space without encountering much resistance. Well, and of course, when you have this sort of magic machines or magic production, you need to renew your style, your objects, your images from time to time. Otherwise, there's a certain tiring or fatiguing of the recipient. So the magic doesn't last. So here's the connectome again, and I really just know the connectome in the last few days. So I haven't made up my mind fully about it. But I think I said it in the introduction in the first session that this brings several things together. And of course, on the one hand, it brings this big science appeal. Here's the connectome. It's something that is basically mirroring the Human Genome Project. And it's big science. It's a big thing. We do it right. And it's a next frontier of science, etc. So it has that rhetoric about it. But then you see the image and you know what sort of arbitrariness there is in the visual renderings of the data that are gathered. And then look at what they do. And it's really something distinct from the brain images, from the scan images. It's obviously something far removed from the biological, slimy reality of an actual brain that you just take out of a skull. And that thing has this aesthetic appeal. And then, of course, the way that pundits are now called forth to talk about it. We skipped the video of Sebastian Sion, but you can look at it up on YouTube. When you just type IMI connectome into Google, you will have the video by Seung, and he's just saying that. And well, that's what we are, and it's unique for each individual. It's beautiful. It's aesthetic, and so there's this new appeal, and it's an interesting combination of moving away from the material, slimy biological reality to pure information, pure connection, pure communication, and to this unique idea of wiring and patterning that's unique for each individual, that records your life history, your experience. And somehow, so there's this flattering aspect of it that things that earlier generations of reductivist naturalists wanted to dismount or discard, that say, well, humans are not unique and we're just animals. And this is something completely different. So my last thought to begin with is one that is the following, and that probably fits to that connectome thing a little bit. Hasn't our world, our life world today, become, in a way, a neuronal world, a neuronal environment? So that, when that is true, what neuroscience brings forth is appealing because it is evidently true of our life world, of our reality today, of our practices. So take the workplace. In German, we have the nice word Kopfarbeit. I don't know if you have it in English too. Head work. Work with a head. So the work world has changed in really immense. It extends to intellectual labor, to communicative labor, to working in offices with computers, with technical applications. Less. I mean, probably it's an illusion, but at least those spheres that communicate brain science are head workers, people that work with their heads. So the brain has some sort of centrality, and then of course communication, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, all these notions floated in the past 20 years by neuroscientists are suddenly the norms in the workplace. Take media and communication. I mean, that's probably the most trivial aspect, that the media ecology in which we exist has changed rapidly, prizing attention capacities, rapid perceptual processes, subliminal perceptions. Of course, also this is a stratum of subjectivity that is not the classical Enlightenment subject, a rational being that has a life history, that makes up their minds, that engage in deeper political conversations, or a certain self, how do you call this, self-reflections that should give you an insight into your situation. But now today's world has changed to a much more rapid, much more attention-focused society. Consumer society, of course, the big topic, only 100 years old or so, that prizes, of course, the affectives, the visceral processes of affective deployment, decision-making processes that are somehow foregrounded. And then, of course, the clinic, the rise of new signature diseases today, like ADHD, which is just the flip side of these attention demands. Depression, basically the flip side of the demands in the workplace, of being self-motivated, of being a center of agency, of being a communicative center of interest. When that all somehow erodes or depletes, then you're depressed. And depression is really, I mean, as Ehrenberg argued, the French sociologist, our signature disease. And then Alzheimer's, of course, a neurodegenerative disease that is just much more present in today's world because we all live much longer. So just to sum this up, it seems that there are certain levels or elements of subjectivity and of personal skills foregrounded in our world that are congenial to neuroscience. And that's why neuroscience seems so self-evident. So here, to sum this up, what it probably might mean, and Suparna invented this term, I think, flat self, in our group work. I don't know whether anybody else has talked about that already. So there's this different subjectivity foregrounded here. And well, the first claim would be it's world adequate. Today's world matches dominant images of neuronal functioning. I talked about it: attention, emotion, stress, subliminal perception, rapid decision making, etc. And then this flat self has a relief function, probably. It's liberating to be told that we are just a shallow user illusion, as Thomas Metzinger and some other neurophilosophers say, of a super complex neural system that we have no chance of understanding. So classical self-reflection, making up one's mind about one's own life, one's existence, is pointless because we never get to it, into this complexity. And so we have limited insight in our situation, relieves us from taking responsibility probably for the political situation we are in. We have limited agency. I mean, our agency might be, it's just these automatic processes that run up, responding to cues from the environment, and then we confabulate our rationalizations afterwards. So in a way, it relieves us from taking up or full engagement and responsibility for our lives. Well, of course, charms of the new. I mean, that's what the first thing I talked about, these appeal of the techno-scientific images and the narratives of progress, the technologies that materialize this and that add, through a certain effective appeal, evidence to these narratives that might be quite speculative and not really grounded in facts. But that's something that projects into the future, and that's of course flattering to enroll in one of these narratives. But then still the lingering on of the old. I mean, in the connectome you see that when there's basically even the soul, the unique, aesthetically appealing signature of the individual comes back. So somehow the old lingers because the brain functions as a projection screen for aspects of a traditional concept of mind or self that we might want to cherish, such as individuality or unique personality. So somehow, and that's also a claim that Fernando Vidal and others make, that this figure of brainhood is in a way not a complete radical shift with what was before, but it carries within itself, or it takes under its strides, aspects of traditional concepts of mind and self. And so to conclude my part, and responding or taking up something that Ian talked about, the mind is the brain. In a way, this is a sociological truth, a truth about our life world, about our culture, more than it is a philosophical or scientific one. And that makes it evident and appealing. And it's something that Malabou also talks about, that this identity is evident also from the way we talk, from the way we act. And well, that's something for discussion. And I think Suparna will now use a case study to either substantiate a little bit or to disagree with my broad-stroke vision.
Certainly some sociologists have suggested that as we come into contact with more neurological materials, so neurological theories, treatments, policies, we start to talk about ourselves in new ways. We start to talk about ourselves in terms of the brain through what some people have called a folk neurology. And we start to think about ourselves on those terms and work on ourselves through this emerging cerebral selfhood. So I want to ask whether that's really the case, and if it is, what it might offer us. So Eric Racine has used this term neurorealism. He's pointed to an increase in our beliefs in the truth of brain science and the images of brain science. And that's associated as well with an increase in neuroessentialism, the idea that the brain can be equated with subjectivity or our sense of identity. So you may have seen work by Scott Vrecko, who's done some analysis of online blogs where people with alcohol problems, alcoholics, are talking about their circumstances. They're talking to each other about their diagnoses, their circumstances, and he's shown that they prefer to talk about themselves as endorphin challenged rather than the more morally laden I'm an alcoholic. So this then raises the question of whether talking about ourselves, framing ourselves in terms of the brain, alleviates us of some kind of responsibility, de-responsibilizes ourselves from our circumstances, and alleviates us of that moral burden. So I want to ask whether, in some ways, the brain is a preferable framework to talking about ourselves in terms of symbols or class or our histories, and whether these are even at odds with each other, whether the brain is taking over from these other ways of talking about ourselves. Okay. This neurological reflexivity, this way of talking about ourselves in terms of our brains, or understanding ourselves in terms of our brains, is often now bound up with neuroplasticity. So, as you know, plasticity refers to the brain's ability to modify itself in response to its own functions and the environment. Neuroplasticity has become incredibly appealing for a whole lot of audiences, and it's been really important for the neuroscience community. So neuroplasticity isn't just referring to developmental plasticity during early life and in adolescence, but it's become huge, partly, and our colleague Tobias Rees here at McGill has also done really interesting work on this. The finding of neurogenesis, the idea that new neurons can develop in the adult brain, has been really groundbreaking in the neuroscience community. So all these things coming together, the idea of developmental plasticity being so prolonged, the idea that neurogenesis is possible, gives the sense of the brain, as I said the other day, as a site of transformation. And in some ways, neuroplasticity avoids the kind of crass reductionism that's always been associated with understanding ourselves in terms of the brain. So there are all sorts of really positive, optimistic readings, not just among lay people who are reading these kinds of manuals and self-help books, but also among theorists, philosophers. The excitement, I think, hinges on the idea that the brain can be understood in terms of flux. It has a sense of historicity. It's not just associated with rigidity and fixity. We're not immutable. Our brains are plastic, and we have all sorts of ways of acting on the brain. So you can see why that's so appealing. As neuroplasticity has become such a huge phenomenon, there's been a proliferation of these kinds of books, a new neuroscientific and also pseudo-neuroscientific expertise that teaches the layperson how to use this kind of knowledge, how to use neuroscience to enhance our brains, to optimize our brains, how to empower people to develop a kind of self-mastery. And the idea is that the brain has a high degree of malleability and also reversibility. So we can sculpt it and mold it. It can also change. We can reverse these processes. And you can see that this idea resonates really strongly with existing self-help discourses and positive psychology. It's never too late to train the brain, whether it's through psychotherapy, music, meditation, or even Sudoku. In some cases, though, this knowledge isn't just to empower ourselves to enhance the brain, but it's also a kind of knowledge base to try and manage our brains to avoid risks or to deal with the risks that the developing brain poses. And this is the case for adolescents. So I want to dwell on the adolescent brain for a few minutes because it's become a huge project since neuroimaging really unfolded in the 90s. I'll talk a little bit about some of the science of this. It was really in the mid-90s that adolescent brain development became such a flourishing project, and neuroimaging is really important to this story. It was in the mid-90s in the NIMH where there were some landmark studies. So suddenly it became possible to scan teenage brains, to scan developing brains, and look at what's going on non-invasively. So until then, it was only post-mortem brains that were being used to look at what's going on in the developing brain. So neuroimaging makes it possible to scan hundreds of brains. The NIMH fly people over from all over the place. They have huge sample sizes, and they've been charting the development of the brain from early life through to adulthood. And it became possible to see that brain development is much more protracted than was previously thought. So until then, neuroscientists used to think of brain development as more or less settled by, well, middle childhood. And now suddenly there were huge changes being shown, structural changes, during adolescence. Adolescence has begun to be understood as a new critical period. We talked about this the other day, a new sensitive period of change. And what these studies show is that the areas of the brain that are changing are the very areas related to things like executive function and social cognition. So these are, it refers to tasks like planning and multitasking, strategic thinking, but also empathy and perspective taking. So since these structural brain imaging studies, there's been a whole host of fMRI studies looking at the cognitive correlates of these structural changes. Okay, so the idea of the teen brain as a different brain, you can imagine it's been a really appealing idea outside of science as well. It was quickly taken up in education and health policy. A lot of the time there's a sense when you talk to people about the teen brain as a different brain that it's so satisfying as an explanation because it's validating what people already know, at least in the cultures and the countries where this science is so huge. So people often talk about, in fact, articles often begin with, neuroimaging articles often begin with a couple of sentences about how we anecdotally know that teenagers are risk takers, they lack empathy, they can't plan for the future, they sulk and so on, and with neuroimaging at last we know why. So there's something really satisfying about that, and makes it almost self-evident that the teen brain is a different brain and is going through all these restructuring processes that cause it to be still in a process of maturation and not quite at the level of the adult brain. And interestingly, it's often, this is a phrase that people often use to talk about the teen brain in neuroscience but also in policy, a period of vulnerabilities and opportunities. So the mere fact of this restructuring process, the mere finding of this malleability puts adolescents at a higher risk for all sorts of things, a higher risk for mental illness, but also just general problem behaviors, risk-taking, substance abuse. But also you can see that if the brain is malleable and it's going through this restructuring, it's also a ripe phase for interventions, all sorts of interventions, because it's most receptive to environmental stimuli at this period. So it's most vulnerable, but it's also most receptive to interventions. I mentioned that it had been picked up by policy. It's been picked up very quickly by the media. You probably will have come across. In fact, I meant to bring a National Geographic magazine, and there's another one coming out soon on the teen brain. This is just an excerpt of some headlines in England a couple of years ago, across the board. You can see from the BBC to the broadsheets and the tabloids, and also London Light, which is a ghastly paper, and somehow between pictures of the Beckhams and the TV Guide, they still managed to have an article on the teen brain. Actually, at this point, I just wanted to share with you that during the London riots in 2011, there was all this discussion in the media about what was going on with teenagers, what could be causing this unease. And a couple of neuroscientists put out there this kind of reminder, don't forget, these are teen brains that are running around looting. So suddenly, neuroscience of the teen brain became a kind of plausible explanation for what was happening in England. So I won't go into this right now, but there's a whole range of challenges that remain to be resolved for this area of developmental cognitive neuroscience. Some of this applies to cognitive neuroscience more generally, and we've covered them. But there are really specific issues to do with developmental cognitive neuroscience. What counts as a normal developmental trajectory? What should we be comparing to when we're looking to identify at-risk youth? These things aren't known yet, but regardless, it's been this kind of, the preliminary data from these findings have spilt into other domains very, very quickly. In fact, in the UK again, and I think in the US there are rumblings of this, the teen brain has become an important target for governments to act on. So there's a new government initiative called Mental Capital and Wellbeing in the UK. And the idea of this is to capitalize on mental resources, on cognitive resources, in order to work towards a healthy and productive adult citizenry in the UK. So the rationale is very much an economic one about how to have a healthy and productive workforce. And teenagers pose a risk, but teenagers also provide potential. Because of this idea that they're going through this period of plasticity, malleability, it's also conceived of as a period of potentiality. So it's a moment to identify risks and a moment to intervene and maximize on cognitive capital. It's part of a broader trend of early intervention and preemptive intervention. The idea is to screen and intervene, as Nicholas Rose has said. The earlier that we can identify the potential for something to go wrong with these teenagers, the earlier we can do something about it. And if we can act on it during this period, the sensitive period, it's a reversible it has reversibility, so we can actually undo some of the problems in adolescence. So the goal is to find biomarkers, and by biomarkers I mean neural signatures of... Neural signatures aren't causes of mental illness or problem behaviors, they're markers of the likelihood of future onset of mental illness or some kind of... So it's a probabilistic marker. So it's not necessarily that teenagers are being reduced to their brains, but this information is really important to be able to predict and manage teenagers. So far, this kind of information, government policy information, health service literature, parenting manuals, it's all been directed towards adults in one way or another. Yeah, parents and teachers and policymakers. But in the last few years, there's been a real emphasis on speaking to teenagers themselves. And this is part of an increase in the public engagement drive. I don't know if it's the same in Canada, but I guess it's called knowledge transfer here.
Oh, yes. KT, we call it.
Oh, right, okay. So public engagement is a huge thing in the UK for scientists and for cognitive neuroscientists. People are awarded points. There are all sorts of initiatives to reach out to schools, send neuroscientists into schools and vice versa. When I was doing my PhD, we had a Labour MP come to the lab and look at what we were doing on the teen brain and see whether they could use it for policy making. And this was very preliminary data. This was actually the first lab to start imaging teenage brains. You can see the enthusiasm for this kind of thing. But this new drive of talking to teenagers themselves is a really interesting one. I was doing some work in London a few years ago. I was part of a museum exhibit with the Royal Society, and the idea was making science accessible to young people. And part of this was talking to teenagers about the brain. There was this huge exhibit where teenagers from schools or with their parents could come along and talk to neuroscientists, meet the neuroscientists who are creating this science, touch objects that are used for experiments. There was a mock scanner, in fact. It really didn't do a very good job of showing how awful having a brain scan can be. It was a mock scan, it was about this big, just like a hat, and teenagers walked through, and of course then they were asked to be recruited for experiments once they got a sort of superficial view of what it's like to be scanned. But at that time, there were actually, it wasn't just this Royal Society exhibition, there were 3 other museum exhibitions geared towards teenagers about the brain. And these weren't minor things. They were at the Science Museum, the Wellcome Trust, all these big institutions that had a new imperative to teach teenagers about the brain. And of course, there's also a growing popular science literature. Nicola Morgan is a children's writer who also came into a cognitive neuroscience lab to spend some time, hear about the data, and wrote this book, Blame My Brain, which has been really popular. So while I was there, I spoke to the teenagers who were coming to the exhibition and to the parents and educators, but I also went into a school, and a lot of these children had been exposed to some of this literature on the brain. I also showed them video clips of what was going on in brain science. So they looked at some documentary material about the science of the teen brain, and there were lots of different stimuli to get us talking about it. And it was really interesting. I want to just tell you that not everyone has been exposed to this language of the teen brain. I think it was about 2/3 who had, and of the remaining few, people weren't captivated by the language of the teen brain. Some of them thought it was really irrelevant. Others kept talking about it as boring. It was just science, after all. But I want to draw out a couple of the themes that really emerged. There was actually a striking resistance to the teen brain because locked in this model of the teen brain are a whole set of stereotypes that teenagers didn't want attached to them. They didn't feel that they were representative. So you can see this in the first quotation, somebody saying that they didn't show teenagers who were reading or doing any homework. I should tell you that the video clip that they saw was of a prominent cognitive neuroscientist, and he was in his white coat, actually, and talking about what the new data showed. And then every so often you would have his voice, and in the background, images of teenagers skateboarding without helmets, taking an ecstasy pill, vomiting in a nightclub toilet, doing all sorts of reckless behavior. And then there was a voice of, well, the synaptic pruning in the prefrontal cortex can explain why children are invariably risk takers and so on. So of course, they resisted these kinds of stereotypes, and the teen brain reified these kinds of characterizations. The other thing that came out of this was, so a lot of the literature is about blaming the brain, putting responsibility, and Jan talked about this as well, the idea that we can put responsibility on the brain and somehow that eases us of some kind of burden. And in the case of teenagers, they didn't want that. They didn't want to be stripped of any more responsibilities. Remember that they're already stripped of all sorts of agency. So somebody talks about you should be taking it into your own hands rather than saying I can't help it. So the blame my brain motif wasn't appealing either. And then when asked about psychopathy, they saw something on a documentary clip about psychopathy. When asked whether this even could be explained by the brain, the adolescents kept drawing in life experience and relational aspects of behavior. So even in the case of psychopathy, somebody says, and a few others said similar things, something must have happened to make them that way, like they may have experienced something. So there was always this emphasis on things that have happened to us as children, the relationships that we have with other people, and somehow the idea that the brain could alleviate them of that wasn't appealing. I just want to tell you that in spite of these things, about 3/4 of the teenagers that I interviewed during this period, in spite of rejecting the teen brain because it holds in it all these sorts of things they're resisting, they also really believe in it. They believe there's some kind of truth value to the neuroscience of the teen brain. So when asked whether this kind of science should go on, they're really enthusiastic. They say, yeah, absolutely, it should carry on, it's really important. When asked why, they say, because it can show what teenagers really are like. So having just rejected it for showing a whole load of stereotypes to do with adolescence, they suggest that brain imaging can actually alleviate them of these stereotypes and show the true teenager, which I thought was really interesting. One other thing was that teenagers rejected the idea of the different brain because it lumps them all together, and they kept insisting on the idea of variability. And although neuroscience is going in that direction, the teen brain still doesn't make room for the fact that their uniqueness or their difference between one another. And they kept talking about this and insisting on it during the interviews. The teen brain somehow homogenized them all. They were all one group that was wired up to behave in certain ways. I want to just present really quickly some of the work on the neurodiversity group, because they're really interesting. Autistic self-advocate members of this neurodiversity community present a different story about the neuro altogether. So this is Ari Neiman, I think, and Kathleen Seidel. So Ari Neiman is the founder of the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, and Kathleen is the owner of the neurodiversity.com website. So people like Ari Neiman and Kathleen Seidel endorse the language of the brain. In fact, they embrace it really wholeheartedly. They like to talk about autistic nature in terms of the brain, but what they do is separate it from any sense of pathology. So here, neuroscience and disease, neuroscience and pathology are not at all associated. These autistic self-advocates talk about themselves with neuroscience as a way of bolstering their identity, a cerebral identity, and even giving rise to an autistic culture. They talk about how autistic identity is something that should be celebrated, not tolerated, and talk about this in terms of being neurologically wired up differently. So they really use the brain science of this. Here's Muskie, a quote from Muskie, who created this website, which I'll tell you about in a second. "My brain is a jewel. I'm in awe of the mind that I have. I and my experience of life is not inferior and maybe superior to the NT, the neurotypical experience of life." So members of this community have set up a website. It's called the Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical. I think it's really interesting. It's about non-autistic people and defining them, naturalizing the difference between them and autistic people in terms of the brain. I don't know if you can read this, but they say, what is NT? What is neurotypical? Neurotypical syndrome is a neurobiological disorder characterized by preoccupations with social concerns, delusions of superiority, and obsession with conformity. So it's with some irony that they talk about the brain as a way to naturalize differences between their own group and others, those who label them. I just want to end with a few questions and emphasizing that there doesn't seem to be a single story of what the neuro is doing in projects of self-making. That it doesn't seem to be that everybody is doing the same thing, or that neuroscience, the neuroscience of ourselves, necessarily means one particular thing. It's taken up with a whole load of different goals and meanings that are best understood within the social, economic, and political context of the groups that are being defined and the groups that are taking it up or resisting it. So for autistic self-advocates, it's bound up with an identity politics. It naturalizes their difference to other people, whereas with the adolescents, that's the exact thing that they dispute. They don't want to be a different brain. They don't want to be lumped together as a group that's naturalized by neuroscience. But in both groups, there seem to be, and in other research with the alcoholics, for example, and people diagnosed with bipolar, there seems to be an authority of the neuro. So even if people are resisting it and doing different things with it, there's still some kind of belief that it holds an authority, that it means something that's true. I want to just, for discussion, raise questions about whether the plastic brain and the popular accounts of the plastic brain are liberating, as some philosophers and some lay people are arguing, or whether it's creating a whole set of new responsibilities to manage ourselves. Are there situations when being a plastic self is a relief? When is it a relief? When is it a burden? in thinking about this, I've been thinking, well, the neuro is just really instrumental. People use it how they want. And then when Robert and I spoke over lunch yesterday, day before yesterday, then I started to think it can be a really worrying phenomenon when people are sort of fed the idea of their afflictions, their circumstances in terms of their brain. And there aren't other competing philosophies or theories for them to take up. Yeah, that is one of the first things, the first areas that developmental cognitive neuroscience started to have this interface with, and it's a really controversial one. In fact, I don't think it really tipped any balances, but it was used in cases to do with age in the US for the death penalty. The idea that if the brain is still changing, if it's going through this restructuring, then somehow it means teenagers aren't culpable for certain things. Dialogue that's happening in the UK, a really problematic one actually, because legal policymakers are really enthusiastic to start bringing in brain scans. I know you have a student who was doing some work on this, is that right? On criminal responsibility and the plastic brain. Yeah. So far, I don't think anything has been implemented in the legal system to do with the brain, but in education, this is the first place where things are really starting to change. Actually, it touches on an observation that a lot of the neuroscientists doing this thing and marshalling it for all sorts of other applications have a sense that there's a sort of liberatory project behind this, that we don't want children to be made responsible for things and to be part of the criminal justice system so early. And in education, there are a lot of people saying there should be less didactic teaching, less tests and exams, and more play in tune with social cognitive development, neuroplasticity, and prefrontal cortex. So there's a sense among these neuroscientists that they're doing something really progressive. But of course, it creates a whole set of other issues, new at-risk populations. What does it mean then to become an at-risk young person who hasn't actually committed a crime or hasn't actually got into any kind of trouble? So it's really blurry because some of the intentions, are. Yeah, well, I agree with you on all those levels about depoliticizing the circumstances of the example of the London riots. I couldn't believe my eyes when I read that. But interestingly, there are some neuroscientists who are now using the brain to look at cognitive development as a mediator for things. So they'll study things like socioeconomic status and look at a cognitive outcome. And I've seen that you can still talk about the social and economic context of adolescence, but talking about it in terms of the brain gives it a kind of legitimacy that policymakers then respond to, which is an interesting phenomenon, because I started out doing this work thinking that it's, in line with Victoria Pitts-Taylor. I don't know if you know her work on the neoliberal plastic brain, and that this model of the teen brain encumbers teenagers and parents with all sorts of responsibilities to manage the individual teenager through their brain, but doesn't look to all sorts of other social and political contexts. But now I see a sort of trend among cognitive neuroscientists to look at these kinds of contextual factors, so to speak, but using cognitive neuroscience. And I don't know, I'm not really talking about the science here. I don't necessarily think it's always such interesting science, but for policymakers, it's a way to attend to some of these larger questions because it's got that neurorealism because of the brain.